Stalin created a powerful and highly efficient administrative and bureaucratic system of government, which in 10 to 12 years was able to bring the country, where many could not read and write, to a high level of economic and social development. The USSR became a powerful industrial power. Completely new industries have emerged: automotive, tractor building, aviation, machine tool manufacturing, metallurgical plants, heavy machinery plants in the Urals and the Volga region. By 1941, the country's population had reached almost 100 million people. The childhood and youth of Joseph Stalin. The exact date of Joseph Jugashvili's birth is unknown. The pseudonym Stalin, which eventually became more famous than the surname, appeared no earlier than 1912. For a long time it was believed that little Sosa was born in the city of Gori, Tiflis province, on December 9, 1879, until in the early 1990s, researchers established a more likely date of his birth: December 6, 1878. Joseph's father, Vissarion Ivanovich Jugashvili c. 1850–1909, was from the village of Didi Lilo. His mother, Ekaterina Georgievna Jaladze (1858–1937), was born in the village of Gombaruli, near Gori. Both of the boys' parents came from serfs. Joseph became the third child in the family, but his older brothers George and Mikhail died in infancy. Stalin's father worked as a shoemaker and owned his own workshop. When Joseph turned 10, his father went bankrupt and lost the workshop. By this time, he began to drink a lot, often raised his hand against his wife and son, and eventually left the family altogether, getting a job at a shoe factory in Tiflis. Joseph's mother struggled with day jobs to earn a piece of bread for herself and her son. She doted on the boy, even though she raised him strictly. In 1886, young Joseph, at the request of his mother, took the first step towards a career as a priest. He tried to enter the primary Orthodox theological school in Gori, but his attempt failed. The boy did not know Russian. After studying with the children of the local priest for a long time, in 1888, Joseph immediately entered the second preparatory course. 6 years later, in 1894, the young man graduated from elementary school and entered the Tiflis Theological Seminary, but did not complete his studies. Already in his 5th year, in 1899, Iosif Jugashvili was expelled for failing to attend exams. However, the real reason for the exclusion was the young man's revolutionary activities. He was quite successful in all subjects. But since 1895 he had been associated with Marxists and conducted appropriate propaganda among seminarians. The path to power. The early years of Stalin's party career were spent in Transcaucasia. After being expelled from the seminary, Joseph earned a living by private lessons and served as an observer computer scientist at the Tiflis Physical Observatory. But the cause of the revolution occupied most of his time. He participated in the distribution of illegal literature and the organization of numerous rallies and strikes. Soon, Iosif Jugashvili came to the attention of the police. In March 1901, after a search at the observatory, Joseph moved to an illegal position, finally becoming an underground revolutionary with the party nickname Koba. In the autumn of the same year, the first illegal social democratic newspaper in Georgian, Brdzola Struggle, was published in Baku on the initiative of Jugashvili. Joseph became the editor and author of the editorial of the first issue. In early November 1901, in Tiflis, Jugashvili was elected a member of the local committee of the RSDLP, and at the end of the month he left for Batumi to organize a branch of the party there. In April 1902, the first arrest followed, and in the autumn of 1903, the first exile to Irkutsk province. For the next 10 years, arrests, imprisonment, exile, and escapes became a familiar way of life for the young revolutionary. In freedom, Joseph Jugashvili managed to join the Bolsheviks after the split of the RSDLP in 1903. In 1905 he met V.I. Lenin, participated in the party congresses in 1906 in Stockholm and 1907 in London. In January 1912 Joseph Jugashvili was elected in absentia to the Central Committee and the Russian Bureau of the RSDLP. Once in St. Petersburg, he worked in the editorial office of the newspaper Pravda. In May 1912, another arrest and exile to Tomsk province followed, from where Joseph escaped after 40 days. After returning to the capital, he traveled abroad several times. In early 1913, in Austria, Joseph Jugashvili wrote an article Marxism and the National Question, which not only earned him a reputation as a specialist on national issues, but also became the first work published under the pseudonym Stalin. In March of the same year, 1913, in St. Petersburg, Stalin was once again arrested and exiled to the Turakhansky region of the Yenisei province, and then to Akinsk near Krasnoyarsk. After the February Revolution in early March 1917, he returned to Petrograd, where he took an active part in the preparation of a new coup. Stalin after the October Revolution immediately after the Bolshevik victory, on October 26–November 8, 1917, Stalin joined the newly created Council of People's Commissars as People's Commissar for Nationalities, and then, together with V.I. Lenin, L.D. Trotsky, and Ya.M. Sverdlov, he joined the Bureau of the Central Committee of the RSDLPB, endowed with extraordinary powers. Immediately after the outbreak of the Civil War, Stalin joined the Revolutionary Military Council and was constantly on the front lines, organizing the struggle against both internal and external enemies. On April 3, 1922, Joseph Stalin was elected General Secretary of the Central Committee of the Russian Communist Party B. After the posthumous reading of Lenin's political testament, the so-called letter to the Congress, in which he proposed to remove Stalin from office, in May 1924, at the Zai Congress of the Russian Communist Party B. Stalin resigned, which was not accepted. In the 10-year fierce internal party struggle that began, Stalin, in alliance with L.B. Kamenev and G. Zinoviev, first managed to remove L.D. Trotsky from all key posts, and then the temporary allies themselves. In 1934, at the XVI Congress of the CPSUB, it was announced that there was no longer any opposition in the party. The defeated opponents of Stalin publicly admitted their mistakes and repented, which later did not save any of them anyway. The period of repression at the end of 1934, after the death of Stalin's close friend, the first secretary of the Leningrad Regional Committee of the CPSUB, S.M. Kirov, the course towards relative peaceful coexistence with the internal opposition ended. A wave of mass repression, known as the Great Terror, swept through the country, peaking in 1937–1938. During Stalin's years in power, about 4 million people were arrested and convicted under political articles, of which about 800,000 were sentenced to capital punishment. Taking into account the deaths in prisons and camps, this resulted in more than 1 million victims. All segments of the population, from agriculture and the army to science and culture, were purged of imaginary and real enemies of the people, while the most zealous perpetrators of the purges disappeared into the running mechanism themselves. Collectivization and industrialization. In 1928, Stalin approved the first 5-year plan for the industrialization of the USSR. It was planned to build more than 1,500 new plants and factories within its framework. New production facilities were established all over the country, from the western borders to the Far East. This was so important that funds for the implementation of such large-scale construction projects were planned to be obtained by any possible means, from boosting the export of natural resources to the sale of cultural property. Collectivization began to increase the productivity of agricultural production, and larger-scale geological exploration of new deposits began to improve mining. The complex of measures taken allowed the USSR, albeit at the cost of great sacrifices, in a short time from a backward agrarian country destroyed by the Civil War to become a fairly powerful industrial power capable of fighting a strong external enemy. Stalin is the commander-in-chief. The Great Patriotic War, the Second World War, was brewing from the very beginning of the existence of the USSR, and Stalin took all possible measures to increase the defense capability of the state. Under his direct supervision and control, both army reforms and the development of new weapons took place. With the outbreak of war on June 20, 1941, Stalin became head of the State Defense Committee, People's Commissar of Defense, and Supreme Commander. Immediately after the outbreak of hostilities, the Soviet High Military Command, according to military historians, made many strategic mistakes, resulting in large-scale defeats and losses during the initial period of the war. Stalin himself is blamed for ignoring intelligence signals about the exact date of the outbreak of German aggression, publicly denying the very possibility of war with the Third Reich, encircling the Red Army near Kiev, Vyazma, Kharkov, and some other miscalculations of 1941 to 1942. By the autumn of 1942, after the heaviest defeats on the fronts, J.V. Stalin finally realized that new personnel and new approaches to the conduct of the war were needed. Not without the participation of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief, bright, talented commanders came forward, G.K. Zhukov, K.K. Rukasovsky, I.S. Konov, F.I. Tolbukin, N.V. Vatutin, O.M. Vasilevsky, I.D. Chernyakhovsky and others. Stalin was not just a well-educated man, a creative Marxist, but he was knowledgeable about fundamental military issues, topical issues of military theory, and science. He seriously studied the works of the greatest bourgeois military theorist Karl Clausewitz, namely his main work on the war, the book 1812, and other works. He knew the works of Suvorov and Napoleon, the works of Dragomirov and Moltke, works on the art of war by Engels and Mering, as well as many other military authors. Stalin studied the works of contemporary historians and military theorists, primarily V. Tarl and B. M. Shaposhnikova. It was under Stalin's leadership that the most difficult situation on the fronts was not only turned around, but also achieved an unconditional victory. Stalin's words on July 3, 1941, "Everything for the front, everything for victory," were perceived by the people as a sign of the government's determination to fight and win. It is worth remembering Stalin's personal decision to hold a military parade on Red Square on November 7, 1941, in honor of the anniversary of the Great October Socialist Revolution, when the Germans stood on the outskirts of Moscow. This decision alone, unprecedented in its political significance, showed the whole world and the people of the country the outstanding personality of Stalin. During the Patriotic War, Stalin, along with other leaders of the party and the state, did a great job of restructuring the USSR's national economy in accordance with the requirements of the war, organizing the defense industry, increasing the production of weapons and military equipment, and creating and using strategic reserves. Stalin's activities covered an extremely wide and diverse range of issues. He led the most important events related to the restructuring of the country's national economy to meet the needs of the war. A week after the start of the war, the government adopted the first wartime plan, the Mobilization National Economic Plan for the third quarter of 1941, which transferred the socialist economy to the rails of the war economy. On August 16, 1941, the government adopted a military and economic plan for the fourth quarter of 1941 and for 1942 for the regions of the Volga region, the Urals, Western Siberia, Kazakhstan, and Central Asia, designed to move industry to the eastern regions of the country and boost military production in these areas necessary for the needs of the war. Even in the pre-war period, at the initiative of Stalin, a second industrial base was being created in the east of the country. It was a far-sighted decision, the true significance of which was appreciated already in the first months of the Patriotic War, when it was necessary to carry out an almost simultaneous mass evacuation of industrial enterprises from Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states, Moldova, Crimea, the northwestern, and later the central industrial regions. The presence of such a base accelerated the commissioning of evacuated enterprises. The relocation of industrial enterprises from the western regions of the country to the east, and the establishment of uninterrupted operation in them, was under the close attention of Stalin. He often called factory directors and party managers with a request to increase production of airplanes, tanks, engines, etc. The evacuation required a huge effort. She became a national hero. People worked selflessly, often under enemy fire, forgetting about fatigue and sleep. An entire industrial power was moved thousands of kilometers to the east. There, often in the open air, machines and machine tools were literally put into operation from railway platforms. The importance of this national feat for the development of the country's military economy and for the fate of the war cannot be overestimated. Stalin personally conducted difficult negotiations with the leaders of other countries, including Churchill and Roosevelt, which led to the signing of important agreements such as those reached during the Yalta Conference. From W. Churchill's speech in the House of Lords on December 21, 1959 on the occasion of the 80th anniversary of Stalin's birth, it was a great happiness for Russia that during the years of severe trials, the genius and unwavering commander I.V. Stalin led Russia. He was an outstanding personality, impressed by the brutal times of that period in which his whole life took place. Large-scale strategic operations were developed and carried out under Stalin's leadership. The war was the greatest challenge, not only for the people, for the armed forces, but also for Stalin personally. He survived it, confidently, and firmly led the country from the very first days of the war, and assumed full responsibility for the fate of the state. All serious government documents, orders, plans, and decisions are signed by him, and everywhere his iron will is visible, aimed at achieving victory. Stalin's reforms during Stalin's time in power, the new economic policy announced by Lenin was revised and curtailed, the collectivization of agriculture, The industrialization of industry and numerous reforms of the army were carried out. The administrative reform of the USSR itself, which grew to 16 republics, and the monetary reform of 1947. In addition, the ideological reform of culture and science in the 1930s and 1940s, the agricultural reforms of 1947 to 1950, and the post-war transition of the military-industrial complex and the army to peaceful tracks can be noted. Stalin's last reform, apparently, provided for the removal of the party nomenclatura from the real government of the country, but it remained unrealized. Stalin's domestic and foreign policy in the early years of his leadership, Stalin built a powerful state, strengthening its economic and ideological potential, ruthlessly cracking down on those who hindered it or even theoretically could have prevented it. The main points of domestic policy were the strengthening of the power horizon, the destruction of any opposition, collectivization, industrialization, and numerous reforms in almost all areas. Stalin's foreign policy was very active and aimed at restoring both the borders of the USSR itself to the former borders of the Russian Empire and expanding its sphere of influence. Despite its obvious expansionist orientation, it was notable for its remarkable flexibility and consideration not only of the current moment, but also of possible long-term consequences. Taking advantage of the defeat of Poland in 1939, the Soviet Union returned part of the territories belonging to the Russian Empire. As a result of the Soviet-Finnish War, the border was significantly pushed back in the northwestern direction. In the same year, Bessarabia and the Baltic states returned to the state with the formation of new Union republics. In February 1945, the Yalta Conference was held in Crimea with the participation of the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of Great Britain, which addressed issues of the post-war world order. After winning the war, the USSR consolidated its status as a superpower for several decades, and its sphere of influence included vast regions of Eastern Europe and Asia. The world has become bipolar. Stalin's family and personal life. Joseph Stalin was married twice. Ekaterina Semenovna Svanidze (1885–1907), who came from a bankrupt noble family, became her first wife in 1906. Less than a year after the wedding, she died of typhoid fever, having given birth to her son Yakov. Stalin met his second wife, the daughter of a Bolshevik worker, Nadezhda Sergeyevna Lilyeva (1901–1932), at the height of the Civil War. The wedding took place in 1919. In November 1932, Nadezhda shot herself. There are many versions about the causes of suicide, but none of them can be recognized as reliable today. Joseph Stalin had 3 children. The son of Yakov Jugashvili (1907–1943) from his first marriage, after his mother's death, was raised by his grandmother, Stalin's mother, and he hardly communicated with his father. After receiving an engineering degree, at the behest of his father, he then graduated from the military academy. At the beginning of the war, he commanded a howitzer battery, was captured in July 1941 and died in a German concentration camp in April 1943. The middle son from his second marriage, Vasily Stalin (1921–1962), became a military pilot. During the war, he commanded a fighter aviation division with the rank of colonel, and in the post-war years he rose to lieutenant general and commander of the aviation of the Moscow military district. After his father's death, Vasily fell into disgrace and exile, suffered from alcoholism and died quite early, at the age of 40. The youngest daughter, Svetlana Lilyeva (1926–2011), became a philologist and translator and emigrated to the United States in 1967. She left behind several books of memoirs, including about her father. In addition to his own children, Stalin's family raised an adopted child, Artyom Fedorovich Sergeyev (1921–2008), the son of Stalin's close friend and party associate F.A. Sergeyev, known by the party pseudonym Artyom. In everyday life, Stalin was distinguished by great moderation. He had a small wardrobe, lived in rather modest apartments and dakas. The leader preferred good cuisine, but in this case he rather appreciated the company at the table and liked to treat others more. During these feasts, many important state issues were resolved, and admission to dinner with Stalin met the highest level of his trust. Stalin's death and funeral. Joseph Stalin died on March 5, 1953 at a government dacha, at the age of 74 due to a cerebral hemorrhage that occurred on March 1 against the background of hypertension and atherosclerosis. The official announcement of the death followed the next day. The country plunged into mourning. The funeral, organized on an unprecedented scale for the country, took place on March 9, 1953, on Red Square in Moscow, according to the memoirs of the head of the GRUI. A. Serov, about 100 people died during the funeral due to the numerous crowds in the crush. Initially, the coffin with the body of I.V. Stalin was installed in the mausoleum next to V.I. Lenin, but in 1960, after the debunking of the cult of personality, the remains were reburied in the ground near the Kremlin wall. The results of Stalin's activities being the head of the USSR at a very difficult time, when the country, which had barely ended the civil war, found itself in a ring of unfriendly neighbors. Stalin managed not only to preserve the state, but also to strengthen it, as well as multiply its territory.